folks at home can hear us? Yes, excellent. Okay, well, welcome to today's Brown Bag Lunch with Dr. Elizabeth Foulke. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Foulke to you today. She completed her BA at Drew University in English, but her PhD here at the University of Rhode Island in English literature a year ago, almost. Her creative dissertation was entitled Intimate Distances, an Archipelago, for which she was awarded during the research phase a Dean's Dissertation Fellowship. She is currently co-senior editor of the Ocean State Review and has published 9 creative works, including poems and essays, as well as a recent scholarly book chapter on Virginia Woolf's Tales. Currently, Dr. Foulke teaches at Clark University, Johnson & Wales, and of course here at URI, where she has developed creative partnerships with the New Brunswick creative writing students, and as a former certified secondary school teacher, has applied her skill set to our classrooms, winning the Arts and Sciences Graduate Teaching Excellence Award more than once, including awards for excellence in teaching from her own department. When not writing and teaching, Dr. Foulke is a committee member of the Newport Middle Passages Port Marker Project, for which she has, among other things, successfully written grants to support various initiatives. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Foulke, who will talk with us about In Intimate Distances, a single studies approach to literary studies and creative practice. Dr. Foulke.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And I also want to check to, oh, you can't see me. I don't have my camera on, or, okay, I just was out of the frame. Now I'm good, great. And you can hear me okay here and there. So I first want to thank everyone for coming, both here in person and those of you who are on Zoom. And I'd like to also thank Dr. Stern, who encouraged me to propose this talk and for organizing this series so that we can engage with each other's work and learn about what we're all doing. Also thanks to Laura Stifler for her work with the technology and the logistics. And a special thank you to Dr. Foster, whose engagement with my work really prompted me to think more complexly about what it is my work is doing. I think it's always helpful to have a reader and interlocutor for your work. And she really reframed how I think about the types of relationships that I'll talk about in this presentation, both in literature and my own life, as a different way of knowing and being in the world. So before I dive in, and I won't be able to see you on Zoom, I know some of you on Zoom will answer this question in the affirmative, but I wanted to see if there's anyone here who knows what single studies is, who's encountered it in their own research or heard about it. No. So I'll just provide a brief kind of 101 on single studies. It evolves from the 2005 article, Singles in Society and Science in Psychology Inquiry, co-authored by social scientists and scholars Bella DiPaolo and Wendy Morris. And this article helped to dismantle some of the cultural myths about marriage and singleness, one of the most prevalent being that married people are happier than single people. It also shed light on the ways that laws and policy and social policy practice privilege and reward those who are married. And the authors introduced the concept of singleism, which refers to the stigmatization of and discrimination against single people. And then 2 years later, the article Make Room for Singles in Teaching and Research, DiPaolo, legal scholar Rachel Moran, and women's studies professor E.K. Trimberger made the case that a singles perspective across the disciplines, ranging from sociology and psychology to women's studies and legal studies, will, quote, broaden and deepen our discourse and enrich the intellectual life of the classroom, end quote. So from the onset, single studies has been an interdisciplinary field. I found my way to it in the early stages of putting my comprehensive exam list together. As Professor Foster said, I wrote a creative dissertation, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But now I'll just briefly mention that my focus was literary nonfiction, and specifically the personal essay. And my aim was to write a collection of essays that would chronicle my lived experience as a single childless woman. But I was having difficulty narrowing in on the scholarly work that would inform my writing. And then, as is often the case, someone gave me a book, right? My professor, Capello, who was my major professor, handed me a book called Single: Arguments for the Uncoupled by literary scholar and queer theorist Michael Cobb. And Cobb helps to undo the binaries of single and coupled, alone and married. He takes umbrage at the idea that the single person has come to represent loneliness in our society. And as a single person who had recently discovered that I liked being single and that I would likely never marry, and I had doubts about whether there was any kind of romantic partnership would be the right choice for me, I also felt cheated by this conflation of singleness with loneliness. So Cobb's book introduced me to, he referenced Apollo, and that's how I came to learn about single studies. And that's become instrumental in the way that I approach both my own creative writing and the literature that I read and also that I teach. So within the field of literary studies and cultural criticism, I see one contribution that single studies can make. It would be to foreground the single characters and to look at ways that they shape narrative. So to structure my talk, I'm going to try to continue to come back to these two questions that emerged from my dissertation. They are, how can we rethink the shape of a life by studying the diverse paths that single women forge? And in placing our attention on single people, how might we center relationships with strangers, acquaintances, or other minor characters who provide meaning, intimacy, and a sense of community and belonging in a person's life? So I'm going to start with my most recent scholarly work, which was actually a presentation that I gave at NEMLA. And even though the title of this talk said about it in literary studies, I actually looked at a film for that presentation. So I'm going to talk about that some. So I'm going to work backwards, and in part I'm doing that to play with the idea that the narrative structure or the plot of a singles woman life does not adhere to the same plot structure that we've been inundated with when it comes to single women, which would be the marriage plot. So in order to chart the course of single characters' lives, I developed this concept, the singles plot, which I've adapted from literary scholar Benjamin Kahan's conceit, the celibate plot. In his 2013 book, Celibacies, American Modernism and Sexual Life, Kahan is interested in tracing the ways that celibate characters configure novels and other literary genres. So building on Kahan's work, I look to literature, film, and television with single women protagonists and focus on the ways that singleness affects a story structure. So most of you are probably familiar with the marriage plot, even if you haven't heard this term before. It's likely, we were just talking about this in my GWS class, that when you're young, somebody read you fairy tales, or you watch Disney movies, or you're familiar with the genre of romantic comedy, or maybe you've even read some Shakespearean comedy such as Twelfth Night or The Taming of the Shrew. So whether it's a highbrow or lowbrow, these stories all turn to the idea of romantic love as an organizing feature of plot. The tension comes from the protagonist and their love interests facing internal and external conflicts that threaten to keep them apart when the audience knows that they should be together. And the conflict is resolved when the couples get together. It should be mentioned, of course, that until very recently, women really didn't have any other options other than the marriage plot as far as stories go, whereas their male counterparts, they could be detectives, they could be fighting wars, sailing the seas. Women were relegated to the realm of the domestic and were stuck at home doing the labor of homemaking and child rearing. So it makes sense that we don't have the same, wealth of stories about single women that we do with single men. Over the past couple hundred years, when the institution of marriage started to evolve from a union that was founded on practicality to one that had to do more with romantic love and companionship, the plot then of literature was often about this time leading up to the woman's marriage, like before she got married would have been, in as far as fiction goes, the most interesting part in her life. And so incidentally, as Mary Catherine Harrison notes in her article, Reading the Marriage Plot, there was kind of this intersection with the rise of the novel as a literary genre, and it coincided with this ideology that united marriage and love. After the woman married, there wasn't as much of a story to tell. So as our ideas about gender continue to evolve and more people are choosing to remain single, the marriage plot endures. And I just, as a brief caveat, want to say I don't have anything against the marriage plot. I love Jane Austen novels. My mother's here, she's a Jane Austen enthusiast. And I, rooted for Jim and Pam in The Office to get together. So I love the marriage plot. But it does trouble me that there still seems to be a lack of stories that represent the millions of people in the United States and elsewhere who, by choice, don't have romantic quest as the organizing feature of their lives. So by bringing single studies to our reading practice or viewing practice, we can identify stories that break free from this tried and true structure of the marriage plot. And this means that writers and directors need to experiment with genre and with narrative structure. So as DePaulo writes in her 2007 book, Singled Out, How Singles Are Stereotyped, Stigmatized, and Ignored, and Still Live Happily Ever After, quote, "It is as if the creative community can imagine no more thrilling way to end a series than with a wedding." In the intervening years since she first wrote that, I think that there have been not many more examples, at least in popular culture, that deviate from the marriage plot, but there have been a few. I'm constantly on the hunt for these stories that have single folks who remain single, even, an HBO show like Insecure, which I watched and loved and was ostensibly about the friendship. I think in the last episode or the second to last episode, the Molly character marries Issa, ends up with Lawrence. So even these stories that are about friendship conclude with this sort of like coupling. But one such example that doesn't do this is the film Nomadland, which won the Best Picture Oscar in 2021. And I mention that because I think it's important that there are representations of single people that reach a wider audience, not just what we're doing here, like in the Academy. Chloe Zhao directed and wrote the screenplay for Nomadland, which was based on Jessica Bruder's nonfiction book of the same title. And in an interview, Bruder noted that she made the narrative choice to follow the nomad Linda May, explaining that, quote, "From a selfish standpoint, one of the reasons I decided to follow Linda May was because she was reaching towards something, and that something was the Earth ship, a home. Linda had a story, a direction. She wasn't spacewalking. A lot of the others, they wanted to drive until they couldn't drive anymore, drive into the desert. They didn't have a long-term plan." That's end quote. So I thought it was telling that even when there is no love interest to a story, to structure the story, writers feel pulled to end their work with a kind of sense of arrival that suggests conclusion. Even in this nonfiction journalist text, it's structured with a kind of resolution in mind. But in creating the fictional character Fern, Chloe Zhao gives the single woman a more unbounded and indeterminate plot line. And I see this as one of the common features of the singles plot. And I think one of the ways that single studies can help us to reconceptualize of our own lives is by helping all of us, independent of our relationship status, to be a little less fearful and perhaps even welcome those indeterminate qualities of our lives. So importantly, the single female protagonist in Nomadland is not on a quest for romantic love. Importantly, the story does put the possibility of romantic love in Fern's path. And importantly, Fern chooses to remain single. Instead of settling in one place, Fern moves alone across the Western United States. And along the way in her itinerant work, she connects with other single people. I lost my place here. Okay, so in part, it's Fern's physical movement across the West that gives the film its structure, but rather than moving in a circle, rather than moving in a line, a shape that implies a forward movement towards an end goal, Fern's work is seasonal, so she revisits these places where she's already been, and she sees and she encounters people who she's already seen before. But I don't think it's accurate to think of the plot in terms of a circle. Instead, building on the ideas of Jessica Allison put forward in her book, Meander, Spiral, Explode, Design and Pattern and Narrative, which is where that previous quote came from. Her book provides examples of novels and short stories with storylines that approximate these different patterns that we find in nature. And I think that we could map Fern's pattern as a spiral, a spiraling fractal, a pattern that, as it says here, quote, roughly replicates itself at different scales and could go on forever. So in order to show how the fractal narrative might be one way, instead of this like kind of Freytag's pyramid that we're all accustomed to, the spiraling fractal could be one way that we can conceptualize the singles plot. I want to just draw your attention to a couple of repeating patterns that are in the film. And by extension, these repetitions have some kind of variation to them too. So to contextualize my reading of Fern, I just want to briefly note, again, I've said this, but that it's important not to conflate this idea of single, married, and alone together. When we place our attention on single people whom we encounter in fictional stories, not only do we see new narrative patterns, but we see how these patterns are the result of the many ways that single people form connections with others. I read and also experience the types of relationships that I define as tentative and temporary as being one possible way to complicate the single partnered binary. So these are relationships that, unlike a romantic partnership or a work relationship or a relationship with a longtime friend or family member, occur at varying intervals in one's life. You know, you kind of think of those little branches off of each fractal as a varying interval in a person's life. Every time I look up, I'm going to lose my place. Varying intervals in a person's life. Okay, but are no less meaningful, intimate, and affirming than the relationships which we tend to center. So I also, you know, it's not that partnered people or parents don't have these similar experiences, but I think when we're able to clear away these other sort of socially sanctioned relationships, it can help to bring into focus these more tentative and temporary relationships. And when we foreground these relationships, we can better understand how we generate knowledge and find meaning in an array of these undervalued interactions and types of connection. So just briefly, I'll try to go through this. This is kind of the pattern that her life takes across the fight. I used the book to piece together the journey that I think she takes in the film. And even that sort of looks similar to a spiral, and that there's these pieces where she's branching off to go to different places. You know, the Google Maps has the same blue. You might be able to tell it's a little bit darker in places where she's been there more than once. And then I narrow into a particular relationship that the main character Fern has with this other nomad named Swanky, who she first meets at the Rubber Tramp Rendezvous, which is in Quartzsite, Arizona. So these two have several brief interactions with each other. Fern she scoops some peppers onto Swanky's chili because Swanky's arm is in a sling. Swanky drives Fern to get a spare after she blows out one of her tires. And at one point, Swanky discloses to Fern that she has terminal cancer. So, you know, as far as the visual imagery of the film goes, you can also see, I don't know if you can see, but they're in the middle of those, the van and then the trailer behind it. I think that you see, you know, we could potentially see, okay, this is blown up now. We can look at the different ranges of intimacy that, you know, somebody who, again, doesn't fit into this category of a friend can experience with another person. Again, you know, here, now they're a little bit closer. So this is like a blowing up of the previous fractal. And then here they're holding hands. They're sharing a moment. And this is after Swanky has disclosed that she has cancer. So the women's emotional closeness is represented through their physical closeness in various frames. This is one way that a pattern is replicated, but at different scales. Both the plot and the visual images further help us to consider how we connect with others. Later in the film, alone in her van, Fern receives a text from Swanky with a movie of Swanky kayaking in a body of water that's surrounded by cliffs with these swallows that are nested in the cliffs. Swanky had previously been chatting with Fern in reference to this location. So this is another way that the film kind of collapses space so that they can still participate in this really intimate moment. You know, you see like Fern's hand holding her phone. I know it's difficult to see there. You see Swanky's hand holding the shell of the egg. So again, it's like something that's replicated with this frame with the hand in it, but it's not an exact copy of, right? It's happening at different scales. Now they're physically distanced from each other. Near the end of the film, we learn that Swanky dies from her cancer, and Fern and other nomads honor her wishes by meeting back in Quartzsite and throwing rocks into the fire. Again, this action refers back to Fern and Swanky's earlier conversation. So there's again a kind of sense of repetition of the subject matter and the story being repeated, but at different scales. Just as the fractal might go on seemingly forever, even though in the film, Swanky's a real person, she's not dead, but in the film Swanky dies, there's a way that she's still present in the scene when the nomads gather. And we can imagine that maybe Fern will continue to watch this movie that Swanky filmed even after Swanky's died. So the movie's final shot also mirrors many previous shots in the film. Whoops, that's the nomads around the fire. Forgot I left that in there, which is Fern driving away in her van. Her van is also her home, and she drives off into the open country. So as I said earlier, I think that the single helps us to recognize these kind of indeterminate aspects of our life. The marriage plot can be comforting in that it appears to give some kind of predictability to life, but the singles plot can extend out into these myriad unknown directions, and it can offer something that's closer to a sort of limitlessness. So I think I will probably condense this next section, which is on my forthcoming chapter, the Single Woman's Thousand Shapes of Love in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. It will be an interdisciplinary connection titled Singular Selves, an Introduction to Single Studies. And I look at the character of Lily Briscoe, who for me is like this really rare example in canonized literature where there's a single woman protagonist, although I think it's kind of difficult in a Woolf novel to say there's a protagonist, but there's Lily, one of the few. And I think by focusing on her as I do in my paper and the ways that she relates to others, we can again see how there's kinds of different ways of being and interacting that allow for an intimacy that is also distant in a way. So I think I have this visual, of Georgia O'Keeffe, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. There's not enough time to go into the many ways that we can apply a single studies methodology to the novel, but there is a scene that I think I do want to at least mention where Lily Briscoe has a kind of epiphany in which she realizes that she, quote, need never marry anybody. And her revelation brings about, quote, an enormous exultation in Lily. So this happens when she's in her 30s in the first section of the novel. And then by the end of the novel, 10 years later, when she's in her mid 40s, unlike so many of her other literary counterparts, she's managed to remain single. Woolf doesn't marry her off. I want to also look at this O'Keeffe painting, and this is in Cobb's book. He references this painting in his book, Single Arguments for the Uncoupled, to try to kind of think through this idea that he introduces called an aesthetics of distance. And he sees this as aesthetics of distance as not just being about like a physical or visual aesthetic, but also a kind of felt and affective aesthetic of what we experience when we're people who are single or alone, but also this kind of experience is open for anybody. It's not dependent on relationship status. So looking at this picture, I'm going to quote what he does from an art historian to make sure I get this right. So Barbara Buehler-Lynn's description of O'Keeffe's red and yellow cliffs, she writes that, quote, the cliffs dominate the composition, leaving almost no room for sky. This implies that the viewer is very close to them, but in order to see the green trees near the lower edge of the painting and the scale and proportion in which they occur in the painting, the viewer must be very far from the cliffs. Thus, O'Keeffe combined two very different points of view into a single painting whose spaces are both close and distant. And that's the kind of feeling that I think we see in Lily Briscoe at the very end of the novel. I believe it's what she's looking for throughout the novel. She's trying to find these ways to connect to Mrs. Ramsay, to other characters in the book. She's kind of questioning if romantic love is the only way in which we can have this kind of like deep and almost mystical union with another person. She does have those moments where she does experience it. And one that I look at in my chapter is this moment at the end of the book, of the novel, where she's on the lawn of the Ramsay summer house. She's working on her painting, which she had put aside for 10 years. And next to her is this other character, Mr. Carmichael, who is a widow, also single like Lily. The two of them really don't have, they have the type of relationship that would really be hard to characterize. They're both friends of the Ramsays. But, as she talks about her relationship with him, She says that, quote, they only mumbled at each other on the staircase. They looked up at the sky and said it would be fine. But this was one way of knowing people, she thought, to know the outline, not the detail. So in Lily's feelings towards Mr. Carmichael, we witnessed something of what is called the faraway nearby. That's an idea that O'Keeffe talks about in her letters to Stigler, but that she also tries to capture in her paintings. And I think the faraway nearby is similar to this aesthetics of distance or this intimate distance that I'm trying to think about. So when at the end of the novel, Mr. Ramsay and his children are nearing their destination of the lighthouse and Lily's on the lawn and Mr. Carmichael is next to her and the two of them really haven't spoken at all for these however much time has passed, Lily says, "He must have reached it," said Lily Briscoe out loud. When she utters this, she again becomes aware of Mr. Carmichael's proximity, and she has a sense that they had been participating in this shared experience. Quote, she felt she had been right. They had not needed to speak. They had been thinking the same things, and he had answered her without her asking him anything. So Lily perceives this shared kind of form of consciousness between herself and Mr. Carmichael. It's kind of a unity that's not contingent on romantic or familial love. And it's one that's accessible to people whose paths we cross intermittently. It's achieved by what is left unspoken and unknown. And this is how Lily reaches this kind of closeness that's also distant, which we might think of as a different way of knowing a person that's not the same as like living with a romantic partner and you learn all about their annoying habits and stuff like this. Lily doesn't have to deal with that with Mr. Carmichael, but she's still able to have this really like unions, as I said, this moment together. So finally, I'll arrive at my own creative writing, and that evolved in part out of my dismay at the dearth of single women in literature who were not merely this trope of the crazy cat lady or the bitter spinster. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, I came to my own revelation, just like Lily, that I need not marry. And when I looked out in the world to try to find other people like me, before I found my way to single studies, I was beginning to think that I was an anomaly. But of course, this wasn't the case at all. The number of single people in the United States continues to rise, as does the number of people who have never married. Single people, when they categorize, as often includes divorced people and widows. So now they're also looking at people who have never married and those who live alone. So it wouldn't include cohabitating people either. So that statistic, that demographic continues to rise. But the stories that we're presented with belie this reality. So just as singles are stigmatized in society, they're often stigmatized in literature. The examples of Lily and Fern are anomalies. But though I suspect that as more people stay single, we'll have more stories that present us with the kind of singleness that does have a nuance and a complexity to it. Perhaps I always have to conjure up the most famous literary spinster, Charles Dickens' Miss Havisham. And to me, she served as a cautionary tale. When I was a young reader, I read Great Expectations in 9th grade, and it seemed like there would be no worse fate than to grow up and become Miss Havisham. She's this kind of bitter, withered, dodgy old maid. So again, if that's the life that you want, where can you look to have this sort of positive representation? As I was constructing, not the Miss Havisham life, but another kind of life, a Lily life. In constructing my comprehensive exam reading list, which was not fiction, but it was life writing by women, so like memoirs and personal essays, I was again at a loss when it came to finding work about single women in nonfiction literature. Again, even books that were ostensibly about a woman's choice to be solitary or unmarried, such as Cheryl Strayed's Wild or Kate Bollock's Spinster, ended with the women partnered. Like an 18th century Austen novel or a 21st century rom-com, the plot had to end with marriage. My advisor, Dr. Capello, pushed me to think about the ways in which the form that life writing takes makes certain subjectivities and identities possible. So just like the novel adheres to a set of generic rules, there's this kind of formulaic component to a memoir. And when women who were once single are writing about their adulthood, it's often the case that they also fall into this trap of giving the reader what the reader wants, or what we've come to expect at least, which is a kind of resolution through partnership. But I did have more luck with the essay. Writers such as Brialyn Hopper, Vivian Gornick, and Kyoko Mori wrote about their singleness as something that was other than just a temporary state, that was on the way to partnership. So in thinking about how I might be able to work within existing literary forms, the essay appealed to me. For one, it's often categorized by its kind of rambling and meandering form. And I think there's a type of mirroring back and forth between the essay's discursiveness and the indeterminacy of the single's life. And essaying also asks that I resist the urge to conclude. So in my creative writing, I sought out ways to portray moments of connection that I've had with strangers and repeated interactions that I participate in that don't necessarily lead to a more personal or revelatory relationship with others, but that nonetheless provides a kind of stability and meaning in my life. So for instance, in one of my short pieces, I wrote about a neighbor who would watch my cat when I went on vacation, and I would water her plants when she went away. This was in an apartment complex where I lived in San Diego, so we were outdoors lots of the time. We would meet each other in passing, we would have conversations, but it never really evolved beyond these kind of short interactions. And so to underscore that kind of relationship, how it might look in literary form, it was necessary to kind of experiment with and stretch the essay. I would never presume that the significance of my relationship with a neighbor asks to be the subject of a memoir, though, you know, maybe there's a world where it might be. But instead I wrote shorter fragmentary pieces that I call microscripts. And I took that term from the 20th century Swiss writer, Robert Walser. He wrote these kind of brief meditations and impressions on scraps of paper. And like the essay, his writing had a back and forth movement between his interiority and the outer world. So within my dissertation, I kind of interspersed these short microscripts between longer and more traditional essays. And that enabled me to give the minor relationships in my life their own value. In another microscript, I write about a different neighbor who helped me zip up my dress before I had to attend a wedding. It was something I couldn't do by myself, so I had to like knock on her door and ask her if she could help me. And I was grateful for her help. She gave me the sliver of time on a lazy Saturday afternoon. I could tell she kind of didn't want to be disturbed. But I do think this kind of interaction was really meaningful and worthy of our attention. So by placing these shorter pieces between these longer ones, I also mirrored the way, or attempt to, that these connections occur in our lives. They're intermittent, they're brief, but they punctuate a single person's aloneness, and they offer an opportunity for a kind of communion. And the microscripts allowed me to experiment with the relationship between content and form. Absent a narrative arc, I foreground impressions made by my physical surroundings or fleeting moments with people with whom my emotional ties are tentative. I used the microscripts to orient the reader towards one-time interactions or brief encounters that don't build toward more significant relationships. So the earlier examples of stories of single women also rely on experiments in form. Nomadland is a hybrid form. Zhao uses both actors and non-actors in her movie. It's not fully fictional, it's not documentary. Wolf innovates the novel form with her stream of consciousness narrative and the unconventional temporality. So I think that the single person requires these new forms of art and literature to accommodate their way of being in the world with others. We need these new forms to tell our stories. So I'm going to end my talk with a short reading of one of the pieces in my dissertation. Even though I've been talking about these relationships that defy recognizable categories, this piece is a glimpse of one of a friendship that I have that's probably my oldest friendship. I met her when I was 7, and we've continued to be friends over the years. In the process of writing my dissertation, I came to understand the importance of having other single folks in my life who I can talk to about singleness. Through conversations with other singles, I was first able to admit and assert that which I held back from coupled people, that there is pleasure in living alone, that I don't ever intend to marry or have children. So initially I was less guarded with women who, like me, choose singleness, knowing that I would be understood and that they wouldn't reduce my singleness to a matter of me not just meeting, quote, the one. What results is this kind of encouragement and an invitation to try out certain types of my identity. And from there, I could go on and talk about it more with people who aren't single, and even make it the focus of my study in this talk and some of my teaching too. So in my essays, I look outward to myself, to these other single women, so that I can emphasize the relationships, ideas, and activities that nurture us and give shape to our life. My interlocutors offer a representation of singleness that works with the other pieces in my dissertation to reveal singleness to be multi-layered and multidimensional. So this is called Maybe You'll Meet Someone. It's really short. Stacy tells me she received a letter from a prisoner. He saw the newspaper article. My address was printed in it, so that's how he knew where to send the letter. It's a profile piece. Stacy bought a historical home in Dorchester and did much of the renovation herself. When a woman knows carpentry, it's still deemed exceptional enough to put into print. Stacy's picture was in the article along with her first and last name. The prisoner told her he thought she was cute, and he knew by her last name she was Portuguese. He was Portuguese too, or maybe Italian, I don't remember. I just know that he said he was really impressed that I could do my own carpentry and that I gardened, and he leapt to some ethnic stereotype about how Portuguese women work hard, which I mean, I kind of agree with. The Portuguese women I know do work hard. But after he told me how impressed he was, he wrote, "The question I had when I read about you is, can she cook?" I mean, what struck me was the casual male arrogance of the question. Like, he's a prisoner and he's vetting me. He wanted to know if I was good enough for him. It was Stacy who pointed out to me that in one of my favorite movies, It's a Wonderful Life, the alternate path that Mary's life takes, where her husband George to commit suicide, is that of a spinster librarian. Like, that's the most terrible thing that could befall her, to be unmarried and to work at a library. My mom's a librarian, by the way. Stacy and I trade stories like this, stories about the assumptions that others make about each of us because neither of us are in a romantic pairing. When I ended a relationship, people want to know when I'll start dating again. Maybe you'll meet someone, they say, hopefully. Stacy worked with a trainer so she'd have the strength to do the necessary renovations on her house. He told her reassuringly, "Once you have your house all fixed up, you'll have no trouble finding a guy." For years, her plan had been to buy a house to fill with plants, a couple of cats, and several housemates. When we were disgruntled teens, seduced by Ayn Rand and Morrissey, we used to talk about the commune we'd helped to create. We didn't consider whether or not the author and songwriter would have approved of us placing their words and ideas together to form the basis for our imagined utopia. The combination of Morrissey's radical politics and morose aesthetic with Rand's self-interested objectivism spoke to our teenage sensibility. We dreamt up a world in which we had the power to select whom we lived with and what roles they would play. In this way, we could break off from the rest of the world and ignore and avoid what we found unacceptable. Stacy's confessed that her house is a more mature iteration of our teenage daydreaming. It's crawling with jade and spider plants and clippings from her garden. She rents out bedrooms to people she's chosen to live with, like-minded people who compost and live as adults with 3 non-related adults and a couple of cats. When I visit her, we sit on the front stoop and drink cold seltzer water, eat berries from her garden, and watch the neighbors pass by. So thank you. That's all I have.
On 2 levels metaphysically. In order for, and thank you, Dr. Foulke, I think all of you who just heard what we did see now why her work is transformative. Everyone touched by her work sees that her thinking and her creative expression of single studies, as well as her power with shapes, whether those are fractals or archipelagos, is unparalleled. So we want to encourage those of us who are here in person to ask live questions. And then I will ask those who are on Zoom to pose their questions in the chat, and we'll occasionally punctuate our live discussion with that. And so that we can be present, Elizabeth will field your own questions here and I'll monitor the chat. So I invite you to pose questions and make comments.
Yes, Eve.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. My question is about a infrastructure. You talked about the growing demographic of singles and clearly growing academic interest in the topic. Find as a scholar of single studies as well as a single person yourself that there is a growing, any kind of growing infrastructure to policy changes to
Hmm.
support growing younger individuals who make good decisions.
So for those on Zoom, if you didn't hear, Eve's question is about whether or not there are policy changes that kind of reflect the demographical changes. And I'm not as well equipped to speak to that, but that is certainly one field of single studies. There was an international conference on single studies the first year of the pandemic, I think it was in 2020. And one of the papers that really interests me had to do with housing specifically. This was housing not in the United States, but in Japan, where architects were thinking about like what it might look like to, like adapt to the fact that adults are living different lives today, and that there really is also, a financial component that's involved with that. Not everybody can afford to live alone. There's also a book by DePaulo, which I think is called How We Live Today, that talks about this. There is a lot of writing on that, like what the kind of like housing and these types of things. But, there's other laws related to who gets to keep a person's social security. Could I give that to my sister? That I think is, these kinds of conversations are definitely happening within the field of single studies. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, I don't know if I referenced this article or not, but there's another DePaulo article called The Urgent Need for a Single Studies Discipline, so that we can kind of coalesce around these policy questions and make that kind of, like advocate for the kind of change that would allow there to be more economic equity, to be more like, ways of things too that she brings up about like how single people are often required or expected to come into the office and do the extra work because they don't have family, so these kinds of things that occur that we need more awareness about. I don't know if that, I don't know what's happening on the political end right now, but I know there's a lot of discussion about change that needs to happen.
Elizabeth, we have a question from Sophia Bono on the chat. And Sophia asks, this isn't a question, but just a comment. I think it's so interesting and important that she presents this to the general public. I never knew about this group, and I find it very interesting.
Sorry, I just wanted to mute it because I was getting feedback, but maybe I shouldn't do that. Never mind.
And I think we all do. And also, there's another question from M. Greco Byrne on the chat. And this is a direct question. Do you think people have a subconscious motivation to have relationships for their evolutionary value related to survival?
So, I mean, we can't ignore this, right? We do, like there has to be a continuation of the human race. Is that something that's biological? Is it something that's social? Again, this isn't something that I necessarily would say I'm equipped, because I'm more of a literary scholar and creative writer than someone who looks at like psychology or biology or anything like that. But my guess would be, if I'm interpreting that question correctly, that there probably is some kind of instinct built in that will perpetuate the human race. But, I think this might have come up in one of my GWS classes. I think it did, that there's different ways of having children now, right? So you don't have to get married and be part of a couple in order to have children. You can have IVF, you can adopt, you can have a child as a single person and decide that you don't want to be in a partnership. So even if there is that kind of imperative, I don't think it means that we have to still have the same kind of structures, familial structures in our lives.
I really enjoyed it.
Yes.
I can jump in again. I wonder if you could say more about the field of single studies. It's clearly an interdisciplinary field.
Mm-hmm.
You're coming at it from a literary studies perspective. Could you talk about the different fields that are coming together?
Sure. I know that, again, a lot of my knowledge is from this conference that I went to, and I had a thought that just left me as you were talking, but other things that are really kind of interesting that are happening are looking at the ways that language also, plays a role in how we think about identities. So that was some of the work that came up in my dissertation. Was the word single is kind of misleading in a lot of ways too, because often that's a word that we think about as like somebody who is looking for a romantic partnership. Then we have these terms like spinster that maybe, have these other sort of baggage that they carry along that people try to claim. So I know, I remember this is exactly what I was going to say. One of the people who presented a paper, I don't remember where she's from, but her first language is not English, and she looks at different, language that other cultures have to describe this kind of identity of somebody who's not married. Also, just saying the word not married, and then a reference to Paulo a lot, because that's who I've read the most. She talks about how there is a sort of negativity, like a negative aspect to being unmarried or unwed, that assumes that like marriage is the natural state. But what I was going to say about single studies that I think is really, to me, something that is important is that it is, in addition to being interdisciplinary, it also is international. So there are a lot of scholars in India who are also involved in single studies. And the first conference was a global conference, an international conference. It was on Zoom, so it was easier to have these kind of connections. But there is an effort to make sure that it's not one of these like academic disciplines that starts off in the global north and then just works its way throughout the world. So it's not just happening here in the US, is another thing that I can say about it. Yeah, like I said, I think architecture is one, and how people live, certainly. Legal studies, another text that was really instrumental to my own work is Rebecca Moran's How Second Wave Feminism Forgot the Single Woman. And that, again, looks at some of the ways that, embedded in our laws, there's things that privilege married couples, and how even second wave feminism, with this sort of focus on a woman being able to have it all, being both a mother and in the workplace, single people were kind of left out of the conversation. Though, as she says, like that fight for equality did benefit single women too. So it's not that there weren't positive advancements from it.
Elizabeth, there's a really good segue in the chat here, a good question following on from what you just said. So Katie McIntyre asks, I learned a lot, but I'm curious if you've read Rebecca Traister's All the Single Ladies, Unmarried Women, and the Rise of an Independent Nation. I ask because this makes the argument that many of the most influential reformers, for example, suffrage, temperance, were unmarried.
Yes, I thought about that. That was in my dissertation. I have read that book, and that's kind of, I didn't have time to get everything in here, so I'm so glad this question came up. It also came up when I read the book Celibacies, how celibacy for a time was a kind of like political identity. It's sort of been overtaken by religious movements, but especially pre-birth control, this was a way for women to remain single and celibate and still be involved in kind of political activism. And I don't know, I think that pretty much addresses the question, but I think there definitely is, if you are free to engage in the public sphere because you don't have these other sorts of obligations as a mother, and not that, mothers can't also be political and activists, but single people have more time and energies to work on reform. So that's a broad generalization. I don't.
Well, and Craig Wynn also mentions, puts a link in the chat to another book, How We Live Now, Redefining Home and Family in the 21st Century. Not sure if you've heard of that one, but.
I think that's the DePaulo one that talks about different ways of living. Yeah.
Okay, I like crime fiction on TV. So have you ever looked at Olivia Benson, the main character of Law and Order SVU? Like it's been on for at least 20 years and she's never been married. So she's like, seems to stand out as, an exception to this pattern.
That's also a really good point. I haven't watched SVU in a long time, but I really like Olivia Benson. And I think that I kind of have another project I want to think about single women in the Southern Gothic. And something that I might bring into it is it's been made into an HBO series, that Sharp Objects with Amy Adams. But I think that the detective plot enables us to have a single woman protagonist, because there's still a kind of conflict that's built into detective work or journalistic work or something like this, like following a story. So I think there's probably more, and even in like these Nordic noir things, there tend to be a lot of women characters who aren't married. So I think there's definitely something there with the genre of the detective novels and TV shows and single female protagonists.
Yeah, I was just going, I read a lot of mysteries, I'm just looking through in my head,
Mm.
I can think of a few more. It's an unmarried woman, like the current one, it's Brenda Chapman, I think is the author, and it's the main character is a detective. She's a Native American, and it's in Canada.
Mm.
And she's like, and one of the traits about her is that like, she kind of doesn't want relationships, or their arm's length
Mm.
relationships with men. So it's like,
Thank you. I'm gonna have to check this out.
So my question is, I know you write poetry. Describing the small pieces of practice. Maybe think about the way
Mm.
particularly thinking of things like
Mhm.
and the way that she chooses this form.
Mhm.
So the first question is,
Yeah.
and the other is, I was thinking about the television series, narrative-wise, right? And English emerges as this person who chooses single.
Mhm.
So I was also thinking about the important work single studies and maybe does in terms of representation, making that relationship. Figure.
Yeah, that is a great question. I did, it's been a while, but I took Professor Faflick's seminar, and I was looking at Dickinson's fascicles, and just as you said, some of these like scraps of paper that she writes on, because there is something interesting about how both she and Walser did that, and how like these physical constraints of just small pieces of paper force a writer to get their ideas across in this very minimalist space. I haven't seen the series itself, but what you said about how she repeatedly chooses singleness is something that I have thought about a lot. It's like, again, with this marriage plot, and that's why I think Lily is really interesting, because she has this like one sort of defining moment where it is really an epiphany, like I'm going to be single forever. Whereas that might not be the case for other people. It might be like, okay, I am right now. Or maybe they know this is what they want, but because of just the way society is structured, there's like sometimes often pressures to, well, don't, even if you don't want to get married, don't you want a couple? So it has like, it does work, it does connect to this sort of like pattern or plot, where instead of having this forward trajectory, you keep coming back to a kind of decision in a way, I think. Why prose? You're saying that, I'm like, I don't know. I tried to get back into writing poetry some. I'll do that in the mornings to try to shift the form, but I do feel more comfortable writing in prose than I do in poetry. I think that each genre certainly has like a lot to offer single studies. And I do, as I said, think that there has to be like new types of ways of stretching the existing forms to represent what a single person's experience is. But Dickinson is like a great example. And, as we're working on just like preparing, when I was doing exams, I probably had conversations with all of my committee about how, she's sort of been, I think until pretty recently, stigmatized or pathologized, or, you know, she's shut up in the house. And I encountered articles where people wanted to say that she had, and, you know, maybe she did, but it was related to some kind of disability. Like there had to be like some reason why she was alone. Whereas like nobody asked why was Thoreau alone, right? It's just like he gets to go off and have this like great adventure in the woods. So, but I've seen a lot, like I you know, I'm going on. I went to the exhibit at the Morgan years ago on Dickinson, and they did a lot of work to, and I think I'm sure it informed my own work, to try to recast her as not being like this isolated person in her room, but being very connected to the world, like through her letter writing, through the people who lived close to her. So I think we're rethinking Dickinson now too.
I don't want to get in the way of anyone else with a question, but I do have a question, since you mentioned the people who live near her. Something that, one of the many original aspects of your own work is rethinking those fleeting, but it turns out important encounters that we have, sometimes in our local environments, sometimes on our travels. And you've spoken to that so well today, as well as in your own written work. So one thing that occurred to me when you were speaking today is, do those, as you described, the outline, when we were talking about Lily rather than the depth, do you think that sometimes those relationships go into a kind of Orson Welles deep focus moment? I'm thinking of on 9/11, I had been swimming in the Toutal pool, and I used to walk out of there 3 mornings a week, and I'd say hello to the NCAA coordinator. And he'd say hello, and sometimes we'd exchange pleasantries, but that was it. And I'd be on my way to come up to campus. But on that morning, as I walked by, he called to me and said, "Oh my gosh, look what's just happened." And he showed me his computer. The first plane had just hit the towers. And I said, "Oh my gosh, this is awful." And I ran to my car to listen to the radio. But what I have found is that my relationship with him has changed now as a result of that one moment of intense focal togetherness around that. Have you come across or thought about the conditions under which those meaningful but ultimately surface level or fleeting relationships can change focus suddenly?
I haven't thought about that yet. This is a point that now you're, you know, bringing it up and making me think about it. And I think that is interesting, because I looked more at these kind of, you know, like very ordinary interactions where the context didn't shift the nature of the relationship. And I'm trying to think back of a similar example, and I can't, but now I want to go back and think about that.
No, Madeleine, though, telling someone I have cancer, can that be that kind of focal? I never thought about this until you're talking.
No.
But now, of course, you yet again opened up a whole new area of thinking about our relationships. Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
There's
Is that
one final
okay?
question. Cameron Frey says, does your work also intersect with the way binary gender norms shape notions of singlehood?
It does. I, you know, kind of today talked back and forth about single women or single people, but there is absolutely a gendered component to the work. I've, for the most part, you know, focused on how that did affect, you know, cis women, and haven't yet looked as much into like how it affects other people. But I think that you have to, there's something intersectional there that has to be considered when we think about singleness, as do elements of race and class and language. So I kind of simplified it today, but there's many different things that factor into identity, of course. So yeah, thanks. So I'm going to ask Eve to come back up and conclude, and thanks everyone for your attention and your wonderful questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foulke, for a really provocative and fascinating presentation. And thank you to our in-person and virtual audience for joining us. We will have another Brown Bag series next year, starting in either September or October. But in the meantime, next week, we are planning our Spring Humanities Festival, 7 p.m. on Thursday, April 14th, we are going to welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Annette Gordon-Reed to campus to talk about her book on Juneteenth. So I hope you all will consider joining us for that. Thank you again.